Next panel up, and hopefully not go too far into your lunchtime. We're going to try to get right back on track. So if you'll just give us a minute. Brian. So our next session is examples of multi-benefit projects in the American River Basin region. And we have Brian Keating and Jay Singh. And again, their bios are in the program, and they're going to give you some examples of what's going on in our region currently.
Good morning. I'm Brian again with Placer County Flood Control District. And this is a presentation we're making today, and we appreciate the opportunity to present our project because we are trying to get out the benefits of the project now that it's completed. It is our Antelope Creek Flood Control Project. It's the first phase of a two-phase project within the Dry Creek watershed. The Dry Creek watershed includes the communities of Roseville, Rockland, Loomis, and Placer County. Go to this next. And this is a depiction of the watershed itself. It's about a 100 square mile watershed that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. The project sits on Antelope Creek, just above the confluence with the Dry Creek main stem. Some challenges and successes, I'm going to talk about with the project today, and these include working around two adjacent closed landfills. As you see in the picture here, we've got the open space bike trail as well as two landfills and an existing culvert crossing that we're looking at replacing as part of this project. What the previous culvert system looked like, and then we had a washout in 2017. This type of washout actually had occurred something like 2 or 3 times before in the past. It's because the culvert system was under-designed, and you can see it's actually kind of poorly designed at this point. It also represented a fish passage barrier, not a complete barrier, but a partial barrier. So some background, we were looking for a regional flood solution, but also a multi-objective type project. We're looking to reduce as much as 760 CFS of peak flow measured down in downtown Roseville. First phase of the project produced about 530 CFS of peak flow reduction. There are multi-objective components. I'll get into that a little bit later. We had multiple partners and funding partners on this project, including 2 DWR grants, one from the Urban Stream Restoration Program, another from the Integrated Regional Water Management Program. We also ran into a funding shortfall. We had approximately $1.3 million of funding shortfall in the project, and that speaks to the funding issues, some of which you've heard already with these types of projects in the local community. We did get support from our 4 member agencies in funding basically a loan for $1.3 million to get the project going. So the project is mitigating the impacts of new development in the watershed. As much as 900 CFS is projected to increase due to new development. Interestingly, back in 2011, we did a study on the Dry Creek watershed and found that LID, if implemented along with our regional projects such as this one, would meet our 900 CFS goal. LID alone would produce as much as 28% reduction in peak flow due to new development within the watershed, which was attributed mainly to LID components that encouraged infiltration. So we're talking about bioretention, permeable pavements, and possibly injection wells. So we went from this was a planned 2-year project schedule. It grew to 5 years, primarily due to permitting issues. It's always difficult to obtain 404 permits. when you're working in the channel, especially when you've got threatened and endangered species like we had here with salmon and steelhead. So those multi-objective features I talked about, the culvert weir itself is reducing the liability that the city of Roseville had in maintaining the site. It provided the flood control benefits that I also described. We've got fish passage improvements, additional oak tree and riparian plantings and removal of invasive species on site. And then we're improving the bike trail that existed there to meet ADA compliance. Public outreach included an interpretive sign exhibit on the trail to help educate the public. We also had some other considerations such as coordinating with SP MUD, the local sewer district, as well as obviously the landfill adjacent to the site. And we had an active bow hunting club on site as well, so plenty of so this is kind of a plan view of the weir system that was designed. We basically are passing it through a 20-foot wide culvert that's 180 feet long. This is how the creek would work with basically a normal low flow condition. You notice on the bottom of the culvert, we've got an engineered stream bed material, an ESM, so we're encouraging fish passage through that process. We've also got a plunge pool created with rock weir that also serve to improve fish passage. Weir itself is a hanging parapet concrete weir that helps to back waters up starting at about a 25-year event. Here's a picture of how that hanging parapet wall is actually backing up. Some of our challenges included obtaining up to 7 flood easements from local property owners. Our design and permitting costs grew to approximately 44% of the overall budget, which our total budget came to about $4 million in the end. That's something to keep in mind. Normally, a project like this, a civil project might be in the range of 15% on design. We're talking 44%. We had long permit processing times. I've talked about that. We had limited construction window because of our 1600 permit. We're working in the creek, and so we had to complete work by October 15th in channel. Talked about these other. This is just a table of the extensive amount of permits that were associated with the project, including that 404, a 1600 permit. We also had to go through the Central Valley Flood Board's review of our CLOMAR, and we are filing a LOMAR for the project as well. Had a tree permit and flood encroachment permit issued by the city. That archery range I talked about, which is adjacent to this site. Keys to success, I just wanted to go over some of these. Is reaching out early to our affected property owners was helpful in acquiring the flood easements. Working with public agencies, we had to appraise the properties and actually purchase those easements from the public. We also, I've talked previously about the funding shortfall. Without the DWR grants that we obtained, the 2 DWR grants, we would not have been able to do the project. Some keys to success, again, permit processing. I talked about it took about 3 years to actually obtain our 404 permit. That was due to understaffing at NIMS and the Corps, and also kind of staff turnover within those agencies. They exceeded their 150-day maximum consult period. We had to write to our congressman about the issue. With that, we actually got our permit. We got attention applied to it and did get our permit. I was just, here's a CC of all the folks we wrote our complaint about our permitting to. And then just some photos here to wrap up. During construction, we did expose landfill waste. You can see here in the picture that tarped area. Adjacent to it is the creek bypass system, all the pretty long 3-foot diameter HDPE pipe there as well. Here's the culvert weir rising out of the ground, embankment going in as well. The view of the completed weir inlet on the upstream side, and you notice the creek riffle complex that was setting up. The creek is reaching a new equilibrium as we speak out there, and we'll look at some pictures. Here's the outfall. The outfall wing walls and larger area here are to help reduce velocities. Here's what it looks like to cross the culvert on the open space trail. So back in early January, we had an approximate 2 to 5 year event, and this is what that looked like at the site. You can see some of our willow tree plantings, their heads above the floodwaters, but the project was doing what it's designed to do. It hadn't at all come close to that parapet wall I talked about, which you can see in the picture. This is an example of some of our mitigation plantings. These are oak trees. I talked about willow trees as well. That interpretive sign I talked about for the public, and it kind of, in one brief sign, it's difficult to explain the entire project, but we were able to do that working with the public information officers from the city and from the county. Lastly, this is an example of steelhead that what were observed passing through the site. So we're confident that the site is passing fish. With that, I'll take any questions.
Brian, what did you have to do to deal with the landfill when it started coming out into your project?
Yeah, we actually had to create a plan and submit it through the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board and have that approved. So we did a landfill cap repair. It was a minor one, thankfully, and it didn't actually impact our construction schedule.
Did you have to put any walling in there to keep it, or did you just use dirt materials to cap it over?
Basically, we used a GCL, a geosynthetic clay liner, was required by the board. So it was kind of like a patch repair of
like a tire.
Cover.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I just had a question on how, with a large county and everything, how do you guys pick which projects? And with the funding constraints and everything, it seems like a challenge to even pick the project. It's a great project.
Right, and that's a good point. I think we had a total of 3 engineering feasibility studies performed over the years, including in 2011 we had a major Dry Creek watershed flood control plan update. That plan actually identified a series of regional projects, including this one. And we brought that, we prioritized those projects and then got funding for them. So,
thank you.
Ryan, just keeping with the theme of the day, can you think of opportunities that were maybe missed to collaborate with other agency needs, missions,
On this project?
yeah, on this project? Was
Yeah, one that comes to mind is we would have preferred to have been able to plant as much as 200 oak trees on site to complete our mitigation for the tree permit requirements on site. Unfortunately, we're only able to do a portion of those. That had to do with determinations from the city. Their economic development department viewed the site as a potential future development site, apparently. So we're limited to 23 oak trees, and we did purchase tree mitigation credits off-site, basically. Ideally, we could have improved the site for habitat with those additional tree plantings, but weren't.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
We'll go ahead and go to the next presenter.
My name is Jay Singh, and I'll be talking today about developing a multi-objective rehabilitation strategy for the Coon Creek watershed. This is work that we did for Placer County between 2014 and 2017. I did this with my colleague Chris Bowles and a number of other folks at CBEC, and also H.T. Harvey and Associates led by Matt Walker. The talk that I'll be giving today is, focuses a little bit more holistically on, watershed scale management and assessment, and the development of a restoration and kind of management strategy for a system like this. It'll touch on a number of aspects of stormwater and hydrology, but also cover a lot of other facets of just kind of the overall watershed environment and ecosystem. In terms of where I'll go with the presentation specifically, I'll talk a little bit more about the objectives of the Coon Creek watershed assessment that drove this work. I'll talk about our approach to assessing the environment out there, and also evaluating the disturbances that have happened over time. And then I'll also cover that development of restoration and management opportunities for the system. The watershed location, if you're not familiar with where it's located, it's about 20 miles north and northeast of Sacramento. Kind of zoom in here on the next slide. The headwaters are essentially directly north of Auburn. You've probably driven through that kind of very eastern edge of the watershed on Interstate 80 at some point. That portion of the watershed is up in the kind of, lower portion of the Sierra foothills, and then as the watershed kind of drops down to the floor of the Central Valley, Coon Creek becomes a much kind of different looking environment that has a lot more agricultural impacts and land uses around it. And finally, on the far western side of the watershed, Coon Creek was intercepted by the development of the East Side Canal in the early 1900s, which routes all of Coon Creek's flow, and as well as other tributaries of that kind of northern portion of the American River Basin into the Cross Canal, and then into the Sacramento River just downstream of where the Feather River confluence is located. Coon Creek, also just mentioned, has one major tributary called Doty Ravine. That's the one that is located right in here, and that's just kind of immediately north of where Lincoln is on that map. The overall purpose of this work for the county was to really inform the development of the Placer County Conservation Plan. They wanted to have some kind of baseline assessment that really informs the physical and ecological health of the system, and kind of a basis for a set of indicators, essentially, of where the system is today. I know Greg Bates will also talk later today about the kind of use and the need for environmental indicators, and kind of evaluating and implementing and then monitoring restoration efforts. And then the other piece of our work that they were interested in is identifying what are good projects and management opportunities that they can direct future funding to. The Coon Creek watershed, compared to a lot of the other watersheds out in this area, is in a relatively rural or undeveloped land use kind of setting, is one of the lesser disturbed systems in terms of urbanization and land use impacts. In terms of our approach, as I mentioned, it is pretty holistic or interdisciplinary. We did a fluvial audit or geomorphic assessment, looked at the hydrology of the system on both a base and a peak flow basis. We looked at the ecology of the system. H.T. Harvey and Associates did a fair amount of work looking at salmon habitat and also evaluating the presence of spawning habitat and specifically the presence of juvenile Chinook salmon in the system. We also looked at riparian habitat, and then, as I mentioned previously, we assessed disturbances to the system and then identified opportunities for restoration and management. So starting with the kind of physical process portion of the system, we did both a desk and a field-based effort to try and get a sense of, what is the physical process regime of this watershed. It's about 100 square mile watershed. This plot you're seeing up there, that map, is essentially of specific stream power, and that's an indicator of a stream's capacity to move sediment or do geomorphic work. It's definitely correlated with the slope of the stream, and it's also driven by factors like the channel width that essentially dictate how much energy the system has to move sediment downstream. The warmer colors, the red up there, symbolize the most energetic portions of the channel. And then as we get kind of out of the foothills and down into the floor of the Central Valley, the stream's capacity to move sediment really declines, especially as we get to the East Side Canal at the very downstream end. This is helpful for us to get a sense of where the system would be functioning in different ways in terms of how it drives habitat for species like salmon, where we would expect to see sediment dropping out, and how the channel might interact with its floodplain. As part of our work, we did what we call a fluvial audit, and that is a field-based assessment or protocol where you identify indicators of geomorphic process so that you can get a sense of, as you go from upstream to downstream, how the system actually functions and where the kind of different dominant geomorphic processes are occurring in the system, and then how that drives habitat and potentially restoration opportunities. We look at things like the presence of depositional bar features where the sediment is being dropped out. We look at things like bank erosion, which can serve as a sediment source, or the locations of tributaries. We also look at various human interventions that have affected the capacity of the stream to function kind of as it did historically or naturally. Things like the presence of levees or berms, bank protection, which prevents lateral migration of the channel, culverts, and then just the complete realignment of the stream. So some of the things that came out of this is an example of a sediment storage index, but essentially it represents the amount of sediment that the stream is depositing in different features per unit length, and it gives a sense of when the stream goes from being a fairly transport-dominated system to a fairly depositional system. That occurs as we get out of those foothill kind of confined valleys and into broader spaces, and then we see a dramatic increase in things like salmon habitat and also floodplain inundation and the chance to recharge groundwater aquifers and so on in these areas. Another aspect of our work was looking at flow management, particularly during the irrigation season. The system, Coon Creek and Doty Ravine, are both used extensively for conveying flows for both irrigation purposes and domestic delivery in kind of more rural settings. There's a number of kind of relatively low head dams and other measures that are used in a kind of intricate canal network that interacts with the creek. And in terms of the impacts of the system, it's not necessarily terribly uncommon for a lot of the kind of California foothill systems, but we have several cycles if you're going from the upstream end to the downstream end of flow augmentation, and then rather stark kind of flow diversion out of the system. And so if you're starting up here, we add a fair amount of flow. And I should explain on this graphic, it's a conceptual graphic that's driven by flow data we had in a number of different locations, but the width of this blue overlay line is meant to correspond with the relative amount of base flow during the or kind of combined irrigation flow and base flow during the summer months and the spring months during the growing season. And so you can get a sense here that we see a significant augmentation of flow in Coon Creek up here. It then drops off after a complete diversion. We pick up some more water as we're going downstream, and again we experience another diversion down here, or diversions and abstraction along the channel, and then another significant augmentation of flow followed by diversion. And so on an environmental and ecological basis for fish moving in and out of the system, or the fish that are rearing in the system, it's confusing to have, like a sizable channel with, let's say, 40 CFS drop down to 2 CFS or nothing, back up to 30 CFS and back down. And so we were trying to evaluate how that plays out, not only for fish habitat, but also for things like temperature, and the different opportunities there might be for different types of riparian vegetation and restoration of the corridor. Kind of looking at the opposite end of flows and storm flows, we drew on modeling results for this watershed looking at not only kind of existing conditions compared to pre-disturbance conditions, but also in this case here, looking to what a fully developed watershed would look like in terms of where we see increases on a reach-by-reach basis in flows compared to a pre-disturbance condition. Coon Creek benefits from the fact that it doesn't have very heavy urban development, but you can get a sense up here as we get into the kind of vicinity of Auburn that this tributary Dry Creek has a fairly substantial increase compared to a lot of other portions of the system. This kind of information is useful for us in identifying and prioritizing restoration projects and management strategies, especially as they relate to stormwater and hydrology. On a kind of more riparian habitat basis, one of the exercises that H.T. Harvey and Associates performed was looking at riparian habitat quality just by a visual inspection, also drawing on field work that they did on a corridor basis, and just kind of on a course basis, dumping it into three categories of high, medium, and low quality riparian habitat. We can generally see as we go from the upper end of the watershed down to the lower end, and we get from the kind of foothill environment down to the central valley floor, we see a dramatic increase in agricultural activities and so on that drive a decline in the quality of the riparian habitat and also loss of riparian canopy cover, which results in warmer stream temperatures. Another significant aspect of the work was trying to evaluate the fisheries component, specifically looking at salmonids. Coon Creek is thought to potentially also provide steelhead habitat. H.T. Harvey and Associates did do juvenile rearing surveys that look for juvenile salmonids, and they did see quite a few fall run Chinook salmon. They didn't see any evidence, at least during their surveys that they did, of steelhead in the system, but they did that combined with spawning habitat surveys to get a sense of where in the system do we see fish and where are fish not able to actually get to. We generally find that the spawning habitat correlates with where we see that transition to a higher degree of sediment deposition. We get a lot of gravels and small cobbles and things of the substrate class or size that's good for spawning and also rearing opportunities. Another aspect of our work was looking at water temperature, and this was to get a sense of where in the system is best in terms of water temperature for different phases of the salmon life cycle, and where do we see temperatures rising. And a big kind of complexity of the system is driven by the fact that we've got these kind of bizarre increases and then decreases in flows, and also different sources of water to the system, and how that might drive temperature. This graph here shows temperature from one location during a single water year. And what we're trying to understand is the water temperature relative to various phases of salmon life cycle history. And so on the top, we see these color bands extend during the period of embryo incubation and also of spawning. And the green temperature range would essentially show anything that is going to be ideal or optimal for that life cycle phase. This is for fall run Chinook salmon. And then we have these increasingly kind of warm tones going from kind of ideal then ultimately to lethal conditions in terms of the water temperature. Same thing on this bottom graph here, but for different phases. This is for juvenile rearing and also the emigration period. And so you can see that the temperature thresholds change for these different stages of life cycle, as do obviously the windows of time. We tried to take all that information from about 20 different sites and distill it to get a sense of, where in the system do these fish, have the best chance of surviving? Is there even a potential for, let's say, steelhead to actually oversummer in the system in light of the temperature regime that we have? And so we took, the kind of presence of that, where there's different temperature ranges and the data we had at different representative reaches, and tried to synthesize it here in this graphic. I won't spend too much time digging into this, but essentially, we have different life cycle stages: spawning, embryo incubation, and juvenile rearing. And wherever we have green is essentially ideal in terms of the location we have on the map. This is the watershed turned on its side, up here being the headwaters. And then where we have oranges and yellows and then reds are essentially times of the year where that life cycle stage really could not be supported just in this particular water year. But this kind of information was really helpful to kind of wrestle with that question and also inform what are the types of strategies we could use to improve conditions in the system for fish. In terms of pulling together all of these different factors, we ended up developing an engineering and land use pressure index, which essentially is a kind of cumulative index of all of the different impacts we see to the system that essentially alter or impair natural physical processes like floodplain interactions or natural channel migration across the system. So we're looking at things like the presence of levees or berms, channel engineering measures like bank protection, placement of culverts, a whole host of things. Similar to other graphics you've seen, the degree of impact increases dramatically from the upstream to downstream direction. And this was helpful for us to get a sense of, where are the places in the system that we can actually find opportunities that are within kind of, I guess, a reasonable, where the low-hanging fruit, essentially. We don't necessarily maybe want to start with the hardest sites that are going to require the most restoration. We want to start with places that we get the best bang for our buck, so to speak. One other item that I wanted to mention too that informed some of our restoration thinking in the system was the loss of historic floodplain habitat. Tim touched on this in one of his graphics during his presentation about the fact that before the construction of things like the East Side Canal and the Cross Canal, a lot of these systems used to flow further to the west and were part of this kind of commingled large floodplain and wetland habitat that was fed by a number of these different streams and rivers. And that probably would have functioned as a very significant biological engine for the system. Juvenile, rearing fish, especially salmonids, could have used those habitat areas to get, nice and fat. And today, all that habitat space is essentially disconnected from the system. This red alignment is the at least 1910 Coon Creek channel alignment, which had already been realigned somewhat compared to where the channel now flows in the East Side Canal, which is a, conveyance channel that's got levees on both sides. So switching gears to the opportunities assessment that we performed, we started with identifying, okay, on a high level, what are some basin scale strategies that we could employ that are most likely to kind of provide the uplift that we're looking for on both a physical and an ecological level for the system. And so I'll talk a bit more in depth about some of the channel and floodplain rehabilitation strategies, opportunities to enhance the riparian corridor, strategies for both rearing and emigration success for juvenile salmonids, and then things like biotechnical bank stabilization and voluntary land management programs that would help improve sediment loading and water quality conditions. From there, we also developed a number of site-specific projects, as well as management considerations and identified future studies that could be conducted to help build on some of the work that was done as part of this assessment. This map just shows some of the different locations we had for some of the top priority projects. They're mostly located in the middle and lower portions of the watershed where we have very large property parcel sizes, so we can get more done on a single parcel of property. And there isn't quite as much in the way of kind of infrastructure always to prevent the implementation of these projects on a larger scale. One of the projects that I wanted to kind of talk about today is both a channel and floodplain rehabilitation opportunity. On this graphic here, you can see kind of the existing conditions, both on an aerial basis and the topography basis. Coon Creek, as it flows through here, was straightened and disconnected from some of these historic meander bends, and so we're proposing to reconnect those at least for a more significant range of the flows that the system sees, and at the same time reforest some of these areas. And then one of the biggest kind of aspects of this project, and there's a lot of similar opportunities in the system, is essentially to have these multi-purpose agricultural floodplains. So right now, a lot of the lower portion of the Coon Creek watershed, the floodplain areas have been converted to rice fields, as we see in a lot of the Central Valley. And those areas don't really serve as a very functional habitat space for juvenile rearing salmon. And a lot of the work that's been done in the Yola Bypass and other parts of California by folks like Jacob Katz show that our floodplain fatties, you get 6 weeks out on one of these floodplains and you have tremendous growth rates for these juvenile salmon compared to what they're able to achieve in a river environment where they're not able to access the same kind of primary growth and productivity that's out on a floodplain. And so what we're proposing here is taking one of these rice fields out here and using it to grow fish during the winter months when it's not in production for rice, and then maintaining it as a rice field during the during the kind of summer months or the growing season that we have out here. There's also been, kind of a similar vein of thought, talk about taking similar fields like that and also kind of increasing the impoundment capacity of those fields to allow for some amount of stormwater detention as well during higher flow events. This system, especially at the lower end, becomes kind of a giant lake during significant rain events. And so being able to retain some of that water on site and preventing some of the flooding we see in other areas is also of benefit.
Jay, I'm going to have to ask you to start wrapping it up, please. Over.
Sounds good. This is just a sense of what the kind of rice fields in this area look like after a kind of winter flow. A bunch of areas are inundated like that. This is just a map showing opportunities of similar type where you could achieve some of those types of inundated rice fields for salmon habitat during the winter season. And this is just one other floodplain restoration opportunity further up in the system where we could reconnect some of these historic floodplain channels that are disconnected due to incision to essentially provide greater floodplain connectivity and opportunities for groundwater recharge. This was a culvert replacement project to provide access to about a few extra miles of salmon habitat upstream on Doty Ravine. I won't go into that any longer than that, and with that, I'll take any questions.
I've never needed a microphone. That the rice thing was that project fashioned as a seasonal rice project so that it would be palatable to the agricultural community, or okay, because ideally you could do like what they did at the Casumnas and just let that go into a floodplain and let it repopulate itself.
Yeah, I mean, if the county or another entity was able to purchase land to do that, that would obviously be the most ecologically beneficial option. But we have a lot of farmers there that I think would be willing to entertain some type of opportunity that doesn't impede their ability to still, grow a crop, but at the same time provide some kind of ecological benefit. And if we can also achieve some amount of kind of groundwater recharge or stormwater detention. So it's not a perfect ecological project by any means, but I think these types of multi-benefit projects have a lot of muster and are probably some of the more promising opportunities to get large amounts of land into these more multi-purpose functions rather than just, crop growing. So.
Jay, hi. Would they have to modify their processes in the rice farming? Would there be things like the use of pesticides or any of the way that they deal with rice farming, the farmers that would have to be changed? And would there be any opportunities to compensate those farmers?
Those are all great questions, and I don't have answers to all of those questions. Sorry. But what I would share is that I think there's some amount of infrastructure fixes you have to make it possible for fish to get back out of that system. So I know for the sites out in the Yolo bypass, for instance, that fish are able to volitionally leave when they choose to and, swim into kind of the agricultural ditch. I don't actually know if that truly reconnects on its own to a creek channel or if they have to dump the fish back in the river. So there's those types of infrastructure implications that need to be thought out. On the water quality front, I'm not 100% sure about the pesticides aspect of it. I don't know, Chris, if you happen to know about that. So, but I could, yeah. But I think, I mean, some of the reasons that property owners are interested is that I think there's hope that there will be opportunities for compensation. And I know in some cases that they're able to kind of upsell their product by saying that we have fish-friendly rice. And so people are willing to pay a premium for that. So, yeah.
Okay, well, I want to thank our speakers for getting us back on track and on time. And so just a couple of housekeeping things. Please take the time during the break to take a look at our sponsors' displays. many thanks to them, because without the sponsors, we couldn't be doing this today. So we appreciate their support. And then also we have some Sac State sustainability students that are here helping us. So you'll see them in the shirts. There are several in the area where we're going to have lunch. They will help you. When we go to break for lunch, it's available in the Klamath room, and the broadcast is working. And we do have people over in the other room as well that you can hear it. You've got a lunch ticket. They are going to help you there's boxed lunches. There's choices of sandwiches or a salad. You have your choice. There's water and tea. We're going to continue the water and tea service over in the break room throughout lunch and through the break, and more coffee up here. And then if you haven't been to the Klamath room yet, when you walk out the door and you get to the top of the stairs, hang a right. There's tables. We thought you'd be able to eat outside today, but I don't think so. So you can go anywhere on the first and second floors to eat your lunch. Please network. You can come back in here if you'd like. There's tables over there. We are going to start back up at 1 o'clock, and we have a great round of speakers that are going to talk about things that are happening outside in other regions, and then bring it back to what we're going to be doing in the American River Basin. So thank you very much. Okay.